Hello and welcome back. All right, continuing our discussion of competitive advantage. In the last video, I introduced the model developed by Bruce Greenwald at Columbia Business School. He's now Professor Emeritus, but he was a professor at Columbia Business School for 25 years. And he developed what I consider to be an incredibly insightful, albeit simple, but very sophisticated model to think about competitive advantage. After I introduced the basic model, I then talked about the first of his four competitive advantages, which is a demand-side competitive advantage, which is essentially customer captivity. We talked a bit about the idea that your customers are generally happy. They're not sensitive to price competition, and therefore that becomes a source of excess profitability for the company. The second potential source of competitive advantage, and the one I want to talk about in this video, is a supply-side advantage, which is a company can do something that results in a lower cost to deliver a product or service, which then results in higher profitability. Here's the matrix we use to show the four sources from Bruce's model. The first one we talked about in the last video is that higher prices, customer-facing advantage, that customer captivity. Today, in this video, I want to talk about supply-side advantage, which leads to lower cost than the industry average. This is effectively, the best way to think about it is a cost advantage, where the company's cost to deliver a product or service is less than competitors, less than particularly, and then challengers, but less than the industry average. That lower cost leads to excess profitability. That excess profitability leads to higher financial return. That's the key. Now, it comes from a structural cost advantage. And there really are three potential sources of that advantage, that lower cost. Proprietary manufacturing technology or a production process or some sort of service delivery, right? The company has developed a special way to deliver, manufacture a product or deliver a service that allows them to deliver that product or service at a lower cost than the industry average. It also could be the result of a lower cost of inputs. They just have lower costs going into their production process or their service process, and that gives them an advantage. Or they have access to some special resources or location. Those are the three kind of primary forces or advantages that a company can have that could lead to structural cost advantages. Another one that is important is management execution, that the company has developed a culture of execution. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about execution throughout all of the discussions of competitive advantage because it's a nice overlay. I will stress, though, management execution is not a competitive advantage by itself. It gets layered on. So in that sense, it's somewhat similar to brands. We talked about in the last video that brands by themselves are not a competitive advantage, but they can be reinforce a competitive advantage, particularly in habit or in search. This is similar. Management execution can be very important when it comes to a proprietary manufacturing process or a service delivery process. Tends not to be particularly important if the source of that lower cost is lower cost of inputs or some special resources. So similar to brands in the idea that it can reinforce a competitive advantage. All right. So proprietary manufacturing technology, production process, or service delivery is effectively an ability to manufacture a unique product, a product that nobody else has, or a similar product that other companies offer, but at a lower cost, or deliver a service in a differentiated way. That's sort of the key sources of that cost advantage. And Michael Porter's work on value chain gives us a nice structure to think about it. So when he talks about primary activities and support activities, and as we walk through it, what the key is the more of these activities that are integrated and overlapping, the more challenging it will be for a competitor to replicate. So if a company has several value chain advantages that they take advantage of, that it's going to be hard for a competitor to replicate it, and particularly if those activities are interdependent or mutually reinforcing. We'll talk about the classic example in a minute. Now, the fewer of these kind of advantages that a company possesses, the easier it is for a competitor to replicate. So you really want to think about if you believe your company has a proprietary manufacturing process or delivery process, you really want to think about what are the advantages, the sub-activities that they bring to that process? And you want to have that, the idea is unique to that company, right? That's the key. And the more that they have and the more interdependent they are, the harder it is for a competitor to replicate. And that's really what you want to ask yourself is how hard would it be for a competitor to replicate what this company does? If the company has to find more primary or support activities and get them to interlock, then it's going to be harder. If there aren't that many, it's going to be easier to enter the market. All right. So strong franchises have multiple reinforcing advantages. Single advantages, on the other hand, are hard to maintain over time. And generally are specific to an industry, so you want to think through that as well. All right, so the classic example they give over and over again in all of the textbooks is Southwest Airlines. They were in the airline industry, which is known to be wildly competitive and low returns. Southwest Airlines managed to have very high excess returns for a very long period of time. And the key is that they had an incredibly complex, interdependent, overlapping process to deliver that service, an airline service, which there were several other large airlines that tried to do it but couldn't do it. And anybody who had traveled on the traditional Southwest airline, the airline, you knew that everything was different. How you bought tickets was different. How you lined up was different. They often were in different airports. They almost always were shorter haul flights. You lined up and your seat was dependent on when you got into line. That made it more efficient to load the plane. All the planes were identical, so it was cheaper to maintain them. So it was this whole system that was interdependent and kind of organically grown by the founder and the original business plan. It's very impressive. And they created this whole system of interdependent processes that was almost impossible for competitors to replicate. Because it was so different at every stage. It was so different. So this is a case where, if you want to think of it in the Porter sense, the company had multiple, not only primary activities and support activities, but you can see all over the place. The whole business model was different, almost impossible to replicate. And what we saw is several of the large airlines attempted to do partial replication, which ended up being a disaster because they didn't get to the scale that Southwest Airlines had. They didn't get to the efficiency that Southwest Airlines had. At the same time, they were cannibalizing their primary brand. So it didn't work very well. Several large airlines tried to do it and failed to enter the business. So it's a great example of a very different model in a highly competitive industry. All right, lower cost inputs is effectively unique access to lower cost inputs. Just the company has lower energy costs, has lower cost of coal, has lower cost of perhaps labor, but any of the input costs, they just have an advantage because they have access to lower cost of that primary product. And then special resources or location or unique access to a special resource or a specific location. We're going to flesh all these out in a minute. All right, management execution, as we talked about, is a reinforcing advantage, not a primary advantage. But there are management teams that do an amazing job of getting the entire team focused on operational excellence. And so it enhances their competitive position for sure. But just management execution alone doesn't develop an advantage, at least a sustainable advantage. All right, now execution, that cost advantage, you sort of have kind of two components. Operational efficiency, it needs to be part of the culture to be sustained, and it's very hard to replicate. And then constant vigilance, one of my favorite words, vigilance, management's attention. It's just something you've got to do every day. It's like flossing your teeth and general hygiene. And it's hard to do. It's no fun. There are some management teams that are great at it. Maintaining that over time is tricky, but that's the key. So you have really, it's got to be part of the culture, and it's got to be constantly reinforced. That's the key. All right, so here's some of the limitations, however, on a cost or production advantage. And that is that the production technology or processes diffuse over time. What's that mean, diffuse? Your competitors find out. And it's pretty simple because if you have key engineers, you have key managers, they're going to get hired away. If you have some special process that you do, guess what? That's going to leak. Other people are going to figure it out. If you have access to special resources, guess what? Those special resources are going to try to find additional customers. And that differentiated service delivery is challenging to replicate, particularly if it's not that complex, right? Southwest Airlines was very complex. But if it's not complex, then guess what? It's hard to maintain it over time. That's critical. So the process or the production or the recipe or the special equipment that your company has access to, that your competitors will figure out how to get that. They'll hire the people away. They'll hire consultants. They'll go figure out their own recipe. So keep that in mind. This is one that's very hard to maintain over time. All right. And this is the key, right? So weak competitive advantages are single unique activities. So you need multiples. So when you're looking at a company, you think they have a cost advantage, really ask yourself the source of that cost advantage and is it sustainable? That's the key. It could be a true key. All right. Input markets are highly competitive. So you have access to lower electricity, lower coal, lower labor costs, or something like that, your company that you're looking at. Keep in mind that those input suppliers are businesses almost always, and they're going to look for other customers. So if you have access to lower energy costs, guess what? Your competitor is going to build a factory next door to your facility to get access to those same lower electricity. If you have a lower cost of labor, guess what? Your competitors are going to go figure out how to get access to that lower cost of labor. If you have a lower cost of coal inputs or something like that, the coal provider, the coal mine, is going to try to find more customers to sell their coal to because they're a business and they want to grow and have more customers. So those input markets are highly competitive. So be careful about that. And then economic rents accrue to the unique resource. What in the world does that mean? You have access to some specialized location or something like that. The excess returns are going to go to the person who owns the location, not to the renter, if you will. All right, so a fun example. We're going to make a movie with Tom Cruise. Who's going to get the excess returns, Tom or you and me? Tom's going to charge a lot of money to make a movie with it. So he's the unique talent. I certainly don't know how to make movies. Maybe you do. And I am going to be lucky if I get a reasonable wage for making the movie. If there are excess returns, Tom's going to capture a big chunk of that. That's what's critical. I love this question. Why is bottled water so expensive at the airport? Now, a lot of people will say, well, guess what? It's because they have a bit of a monopoly. We have to empty all of our liquids, at least in the U.S., before we get on a plane, before you get through security, which means if you want to get water, you have to buy it. You have a demand, right? Somewhat price inelastic demand, insensitive to price. You only have a couple of sources. And so, of course, that's why it's more expensive. Well, it ends up, if you think about it, it actually is more complicated because magazines in these stores are not more expensive than before security, right? Because you can bring your magazine. And toiletries and related aren't a lot more expensive because you can bring your own. Candy appears to be more expensive, but that's because they sell very large bags of candy or other kinds of treats, cookies, chips, and things like that. But if you really price them out, they're a bit more expensive. But again, they may not. It's a convenience of buying it there. You're paying for the convenience. But water is the unique product. Any of the liquids is a unique product because you can't carry that through security. However, if you really look into it more closely, you realize that their profit margins on most of their products is just like any other retailer. They make a lot more money on water, but they have to because the rents at these places is high. And if they're not willing to pay the rent, somebody else will. And so it's not clear that H.W. Smith is making excess returns just on their water. I suspect if you go look at it, the returns are attractive, but not fantastic. Not what you would think just from the price of water. Water is helping to subsidize everything else because the rent is high. The excess returns are going to the airport, not to the retailer. That's the key. All right. So management execution. I want to talk a little bit about this. As I mentioned before, culture of performance, culture of execution. It does exist. Very hard to maintain, but you've got to get the team focused on that all the time. And the real limitations, challenges of execution are it's hard to implement well. We know this for sure. Getting people to do what you want them to do is not easy. That's a real management challenge. And it's very hard to maintain over time, particularly as you grow because you have to recruit new people that have that same culture of execution. So hard to maintain over time and hard to certainly replicate as you grow and add more people to it. All right. I'll go back here for a second before we end. I'm going to foreshadow for a moment as we think about it. We now have two of the primary sources of competitive advantage, customer captivity and this cost production advantage, delivery advantage. Now, between the two, it is much, much easier to maintain customer captivity than it is cost production advantage. Just to frame the two. Customer captivity is much easier to maintain over time than that production cost advantages for the reason we talked about. The third advantage, which I'm going to talk about next, is scale. I suspect it will be more than one video. It's a long discussion. And then once we get through scale, I'm going to talk a little bit more about competitive advantage and then introduce the idea of sustainable competitive advantage. We've just been talking about competitive advantage. If you're looking at a company, evaluating a company, we care about sustainable competitive advantage. There's some subtlety that's important and just foreshadowing, hinting at it. Customer captivity is part of that sustainable competitive advantage. However, cost production advantages are so hard to maintain over time, they are a weak source of sustainable competitive advantage. All right, obviously more to come. Thank you for watching. See you at the next video.